Welcome back to the channel. There are mysteries that fade with time, and then there are those that seem to grow sharper the longer they remain unsolved. Tonight, we return to one of the latter. It begins in London, 1974, with a scream in the night and the quiet disappearance of a man born into privilege. His name was John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, though the world would come to know him simply as Lord Lucan, the nobleman who vanished. At first glance, his life read like something out of an old novel. A tall, handsome aristocrat, educated at Eton, charming in every social circle. The kind of man who seemed to float effortlessly through Mayfair clubs and casino halls. But behind the polished surface was a man losing control. His marriage was crumbling, his finances slipping, and his obsession with gambling deepened by every loss. By late 1974, he was living apart from his wife and 3 children, caught in a bitter custody battle that consumed what was left of his composure. Then came the night of November 7th. In the basement of his former home, the family's nanny, Sandra Rivett, was bludgeoned to death with a lead pipe. Lady Lucan, battered and bleeding, ran into a nearby pub shouting that her husband had tried to kill her. Within hours, the story spread across Britain: an aristocrat accused of murder, a shattered household, and a sudden disappearance that defied explanation. Lucan's car was discovered abandoned near New Haven the next day. Bloodstains lined the interior. From there, the trail went cold. Some believed he had thrown himself from a ferry into the Channel. Others whispered that friends within high society helped him escape, perhaps to South Africa, perhaps to South America. Theories multiplied, but evidence never followed. What makes this story endure is not only the crime itself, but the vacuum that followed. Lucan's name became shorthand for flight, for vanishing into myth. Every decade brought new sightings, each one fading into rumor. And yet, even now, detectives keep the file open. Nearly half a century later, the question remains: what really happened to the man who walked out of Belgravia that night and was never seen again? In this episode, we step into that darkness not to chase ghosts, but to trace the fault lines where wealth, fear, and violence met. Because sometimes, the most haunting stories are not about who committed the crime, but about how a single disappearance can echo through generations. When police arrived at 46 Lower Belgrave Street that night, they already had a name in mind: Lord Lucan himself. From the beginning, investigators believed the attack had been personal, born not of chance, but of domestic conflict. The basement scene told its own grim story. The nanny, Sandra Rivett, likely mistaken for Lady Lucan in the dim light. The weapon, a length of lead pipe left behind. And upstairs, the signs of a struggle that had spilled through the quiet townhouse. Lady Lucan's statement pointed directly at her husband. Bruised and terrified, she told police that he had come to the house unannounced, that he had struck her, and that she had fled only by sheer instinct. Her words painted an image of a man whose charm had turned brittle, whose control had slipped beyond repair. To the press, it was the perfect scandal, an aristocrat turned fugitive. But to Lucan's circle of friends, the accusation seemed impossible. They described him as cool, precise, incapable of sudden violence. Many were so convinced of his innocence that they began to act as though he were being framed. A few even helped him in those crucial hours after the murder, arranging calls, offering shelter, blurring his trail just enough that he slipped away before police could close in. What remains striking is how swiftly the walls of privilege closed around him. While ordinary suspects would have faced arrest within hours, Lucan's name and status gave him a different kind of shield: time. He had access to money, connections, and a network of loyal acquaintances who either did not believe his guilt or did not want to believe it. By the time his abandoned car was found the next day, Lord Lucan had already become both a wanted man and a myth in the making. The investigation moved fast, but found little. No sightings, no letters, no body. Theories multiplied. Suicide at sea, escape to Africa, even a life lived quietly under another name. Yet none of them have ever been proven. To this day, one detail remains chilling. When asked years later whether she believed her husband capable of the crime, Lady Lucan answered simply, yes. From that moment on, Britain was left with two ghosts, the woman who lost everything, and the man whose shadow never quite disappeared. Sandra Rivett was not born into privilege. She was a 29-year-old woman from a modest background, known for her kindness and quiet humor. Friends described her as practical, dependable, the sort of person who found calm in routine. By the autumn of 1974, she had been working for the Lucan family for only a few months. Her Thursdays were usually her night off, but on that fateful evening, she swapped shifts, a small decision that placed her in the house at the worst possible time. When police found her body in the basement, it was clear she had been attacked suddenly and without warning. The light bulb had been removed from its socket, leaving the room in darkness. Investigators theorized that she was mistaken for Lady Lucan, who often went downstairs at that hour to make tea. The fatal blow came swiftly. There were no signs. She had a chance to defend herself. Sandra's death was initially swallowed by the aristocratic drama that followed. The newspapers called it the Lucan affair, rarely naming her at all. For decades, her story existed only as a footnote to the disappearance of a lord. Yet she was the true victim, the only one whose fate was certain. Over time, that imbalance has drawn growing criticism. Why did the country become obsessed with the vanished Earl, but not with the young woman whose life he allegedly took? Recent documentaries have tried to correct that silence, giving voice to Sandra's family and to her son, Neil Berriman, who continues to seek answers. For him, this was never about aristocracy or legend. It was about a mother who went to work one evening and never came home. Sandra's story is what grounds this case in reality. Beyond the headlines, beyond the glamour of vanished nobility, lies a single truth, a life stolen, a family changed forever. The Lucan mystery may live on in speculation, but its heart remains the tragedy of a woman who trusted the wrong house on the wrong night. The setting of the crime was as unnerving as the act itself. A stately London townhouse at 46 Lower Belgrave Street, nestled in the elegant heart of Belgravia. This was not a place associated with violence. Rows of pristine white facades, polished railings, and the quiet hum of wealth defined the area. But on the night of November 7th, 1974, that calm exterior hid chaos. Inside, the scene was brutal and strangely intimate. Blood on the carpeted stairs, a tea tray overturned, the basement in near darkness, a single bulb removed from its socket. In the scullery, Sandra Rivett's body lay beside the cloth she had used to cover the teapot. Upstairs, Lady Lucan's frantic escape had left a trail, smears of blood on door handles, the signs of a struggle in the hallway. It was clear that the attack had begun in silence and erupted into panic. Police who arrived later described the atmosphere as eerie. There were no forced locks, no evidence of a break-in. Whoever had entered the house had done so with confidence, as though they knew every corner. That familiarity led detectives straight to one conclusion: the attacker was someone who belonged there. Outside, the contrast was almost cinematic. Police lights flickering against Georgian stone, curious neighbors whispering behind curtains. Reporters gathered before dawn, realizing that the story unfolding here would not fade quickly. By morning, the name Lucan was printed on every front page in Britain. The scene itself became a puzzle piece, one that investigators tried to reconstruct for years. How had the assailant entered? Why had the light been removed? And why was the weapon a short length of lead pipe left behind, clean enough to suggest calculation rather than frenzy? In the decades since, that townhouse has become a symbol, not just of a crime, but of a collision between two worlds: the private, polished universe of the upper class and the raw human violence that shattered it in a single night. The walls of Belgravia never told their story, but the silence they held still lingers, a reminder that evil does not always come from the shadows. Sometimes it walks in through the front door. If the murder itself was shocking, what came next turned it into legend. After leaving the Belgravia house, Lord Lucan vanished into the cold November night. What followed was a trail of clues, fragmented, deliberate, and hauntingly incomplete. Just hours after the attack, he called his mother, calmly explaining that there had been an incident at his wife's home. Witnesses later reported that he sounded controlled, even polite, as though he were describing someone else's tragedy. Then he borrowed a friend's car, drove out of London, and disappeared. The next morning, that car, a blue Ford Corsair, was found abandoned in the coastal town of Newhaven, East Sussex. Inside were traces of blood and a length of lead pipe similar to the weapon used in the killing. Police believed Lucan had planned his escape carefully, heading for the ferry terminal nearby. The theory was simple. He may have boarded a boat bound for France, or ended his life in the Channel before the ship even arrived. But certainty never came. No ticket records, no body, no witnesses who could confirm his crossing. Just the eerie silence of a man who seemed to dissolve into air. From that point forward, Lucan's name became a ghost story whispered across Britain. Some claimed he lived under new identities in South Africa, in India, even in Australia. Every few years, tabloids revived the tale with another confirmed sighting, only for it to fade again into rumor. Others insisted he had died near Newhaven that very night, his remains lost to the sea. For investigators, the getaway was both a beginning and an ending. It marked the moment the case left the realm of fact and entered folklore. The aristocrat who once moved easily among London's elite became a symbol of escape itself, a reminder that money and status could buy time, but not absolution. Even now, when people speak of Lord Lucan, they picture not his life, but his disappearance. The empty car by the harbor, the waves rolling under a pale dawn, and a question that has never stopped echoing: how can a man simply vanish and still cast a shadow half a century later? Time has a strange way of deepening certain absences. In the case of Lord Lucan, every year that passed without an answer only thickened the fog. The initial shock faded into fascination, then into myth. What began as a murder investigation evolved into one of Britain's most enduring riddles. How can a man of such prominence disappear without a trace? In the early months after the crime, the search stretched across continents. Police followed leads to France, South Africa, Kenya, and even India. Each tip came with a story. Someone who swore they saw Lucan in a casino, a photograph that looked vaguely like him, a man who spoke with an English accent and avoided questions. None of it ever held up under scrutiny. Decades passed, and yet, every so often, a new claim surfaced. A British expat in Goa, a hermit in New Zealand, a drifter in Australia. Journalists would rush to investigate, only to find themselves chasing ghosts. Even DNA testing in later years failed to confirm a single identity. The mystery, it seemed, refused to die. But perhaps what kept the story alive was not evidence, it was the idea of escape. In a culture fascinated by class and scandal, Lord Lucan became a symbol of what money and arrogance might buy. Not freedom, but disappearance. People projected onto him what they wanted to believe: an outlaw hero, a coward, a tragic figure undone by his own pride. Meanwhile, the families of both Sandra Rivett and Lady Lucan were left with something far less romantic: grief and silence. Lady Lucan herself lived until 2017, never wavering from her belief that her husband had died shortly after the crime. He would never have survived on his own, she once said. He was not that sort of man. Yet the mystery lingers, half memory, half myth. Somewhere between fact and folklore, Lord Lucan still walks through newspaper columns, documentaries, and the collective imagination of a country that never quite let him go. The unanswered question remains less about where he went and more about what his disappearance revealed. The strange, stubborn fascination humans have with the idea of vanishing without consequence. By the summer of 1975, the case had shifted from a frantic manhunt to a legal formality. Lord Lucan was still missing, but the Crown had to move forward. The coroner's inquest into the death of Sandra Rivett became one of the most closely watched proceedings of the decade. The outcome would define how Britain remembered the case. For days, witnesses took the stand: police officers, forensic analysts, Lady Lucan herself. She recounted the attack with quiet precision, describing the basement shadows, the blows, and the moment she recognized her husband's voice. The prosecution laid out its evidence: blood patterns, hair samples, fingerprints, and the abandoned car near New Haven. It was circumstantial, but damning. When the jury returned, their verdict was swift: Sandra Rivett had been murdered by Lord Lucan. That statement carried enormous weight. For the first time in British history, a member of the House of Lords had been formally named a murderer by a coroner's jury. Yet the accused was nowhere to be found. No trial, no defense, no sentence. The verdict turned Lucan into both a criminal and a phantom. Legally, it was enough to mark him as guilty in the eyes of the public. Procedurally, it left endless gaps. Without a body, without a trial, the justice system could not close the file. It was justice delivered to a void. In the years that followed, that single line, "murdered by Lord Lucan," became a fixture of British folklore, quoted in newspapers, novels, and documentaries. It blurred the boundary between law and legend. Officially, the case had a killer. Unofficially, it had a ghost. The inquest did more than name Lucan. It immortalized him. From that day forward, he would no longer be remembered as a gambler or a peer of the realm, but as the man who slipped through the cracks of his own verdict, leaving behind one of the strangest open endings in modern British crime history. For decades, Lord Lucan existed in a strange legal limbo, neither alive nor confirmed dead. His disappearance in 1974 left courts, creditors, and even his own family suspended in uncertainty. Without a death certificate, his estate could not be settled, his children could not inherit his title, and the record of his guilt remained frozen in time. In 1999, the High Court finally ruled that Lucan could be presumed dead, allowing limited closure on paper. But that decision did not settle everything. It was purely administrative, based on time past, not on any new evidence of his death. His name, still tied to one of Britain's most infamous crimes, remained tangled between law and legend. Then, in 2016, more than 40 years after the disappearance, the government issued an official death certificate under the Presumption of Death Act. It meant his son, George Bingham, could legally become the 8th Earl of Lucan. For the aristocracy, it restored the family line. For the public, it reopened old questions. Was he truly gone, or had bureaucracy simply decided to stop waiting? The formal declaration closed one chapter, but it also underscored how unusual this case was. Normally, time erases the edges of mystery. Here, time only deepened them. Even as Lucan's name was engraved in legal records as deceased, the sense of unfinished business lingered. To some, that certificate marked a quiet surrender, the state admitting it would never know what became of him. To others, it was an act of practicality, tidying up what the courts could never solve. But for those still haunted by the case, it raised a final, uneasy truth that in the eyes of the law, a man can disappear long enough to be declared dead, even when his shadow continues to walk among the living. Even after the courts declared Lord Lucan dead, Scotland Yard never closed the case. The file on Sandra Rivett's murder remains officially open. One of the oldest unsolved homicides, still on the books of the Metropolitan Police. That decision is more than symbolic. It means that if new information ever surfaces, however small, detectives are obliged to review it. Over the years, the case has drawn countless tips, letters, phone calls, half-remembered confessions, even alleged deathbed stories from people claiming to have seen or helped Lucan escape. Most turned out to be fabrications or misunderstandings. Still, the police treat them with a kind of ritual seriousness. Every few years, when public interest flares again, often after a new documentary or tabloid claim, the Met quietly confirms the same statement: the investigation remains open. Behind that formality lies a quieter truth. Detectives who inherited the file admit that the physical evidence is thin and the chances of new forensic breakthroughs are slim. But what keeps the case alive is its cultural gravity. Too many people still care. Too much history sits in those boxes of old statements and photos. Occasionally, a small detail reemerges. In 2024, renewed attention focused on the New Haven harbor, where Lucan's car was found, after a BBC documentary re-examined the ferry schedules and departure logs. No breakthrough followed, but it reminded the public that even after half a century, the machinery of inquiry still hums faintly in the background. The persistence of the investigation feels almost ceremonial now, as though Britain cannot bring itself to file the case underdone. It is an act of collective memory, an acknowledgement that something unresolved still lingers at the edge of its national conscience. And until someone, somewhere, uncovers the truth of what happened that November night, the name Lord Lucan will stay inked in both police records and legend, suspended between history and unfinished business. Nearly 50 years after the night that started it all, the Lucan mystery refuses to rest. In 2024, a BBC documentary reignited national curiosity. Lord Lucan, the truth behind the legend. It was not just another retelling. It reopened questions that had long gathered dust. What truly happened after the murder? Who might have helped Lucan flee? And how far his circle of friends went to protect him? The series examined inconsistencies in the original police work and introduced new digital tools, AI mapping, forensic voice comparisons, and reanalysis of ferry records from New Haven. None of it brought closure, but it reframed the case from spectacle to study, showing just how much of the investigation had been shaped by class, influence, and public perception. More importantly, the documentary shifted the focus away from the missing lord and toward the lives left behind. For the first time, Sandra Rivett's family, especially her son Neil Berriman, was placed at the center of the narrative. His interviews carried a steady quietness, an insistence that his mother's death mattered more than any aristocratic scandal. His campaign for transparency and accountability became the moral backbone of the story. Outside television, the internet gave the case new oxygen. True crime podcasts, online forums, and amateur sleuth communities poured over every photograph, every grainy image, chasing clues that professional investigators had abandoned decades earlier. Some speculated Lucan might have lived under another identity in Australia or New Zealand. Others dismissed it as myth, a ghost people had learned to keep alive. What made the resurgence different this time was not evidence, it was tone. The story had matured. The curiosity felt less like tabloid thrill and more like a collective reckoning with privilege, loss, and the limits of justice. The world had changed, but the questions remained painfully familiar. When power shields a suspect, what does that say about fairness? When truth hides behind decorum, who pays the price? The renewed attention did not solve the case, but it reminded the public that unsolved does not mean forgotten. Sometimes, a mystery stays alive, not because it is unsolvable, but because it still asks something we have not yet answered. While official investigations slowed, the search never entirely stopped. Outside the police force, a handful of private citizens, most notably Sandra Rivett's son, Neil Berriman, kept the case breathing. For him, this was never about fame or legend. It was about dignity. His mother had been reduced to a headline, while her killer became a symbol of mystery. Neil's mission was to reverse that imbalance. In the last decade, he has led a quiet but relentless campaign. He has filed petitions, spoken to journalists, and pressed the Metropolitan Police to re-examine old evidence with modern technology. In 2020, he made headlines after claiming that facial recognition software had matched Lord Lucan to an elderly man living in Australia. The claim drew attention and skepticism, but it forced the media and investigators to look again at the files. The police reviewed the evidence and concluded the match was inconclusive, yet the effort reignited global interest. Beyond digital sleuthing, Neil's persistence has kept Sandra Rivett's name visible. He has met with documentary producers, forensic experts, and private detectives, trying to bridge the gap between official silence and public memory. His view is simple. Justice may never be perfect, but remembering still matters. Others have joined in their own ways. Historians have dug through court archives. Journalists have chased unverified sightings. Retired detectives have offered reflections on what might have gone wrong in the original investigation. Most agree that Lucan likely died within days of the crime. But, without proof, the uncertainty keeps the story alive. These private efforts give the case its heartbeat. They remind people that truth does not always arrive through institutions. Sometimes it is carried forward by those who refuse to forget. In the end, Neil Berriman's determination reframes the entire narrative, not as the legend of a vanishing lord, but as the long, unfinished pursuit of a son for his mother's peace. Half a century later, the case of Lord Lucan has become less a crime story and more a reflection of what societies choose to remember. The facts are still where they were left in 1974, a murdered nanny, a missing Earl, and a trail that ends at the edge of the sea. Everything since has been interpretation, each generation layering its own fascination over the same silence. For some, Lucan represents the arrogance of class and privilege, a man who believed he could outwit consequence. For others, he is a tragic figure, haunted, desperate, perhaps destroyed by the pressures of status and debt. That duality is what keeps his name alive. He can be both villain and victim, depending on who is telling the story. The legacy also exposes deeper questions about justice. When an ordinary man vanishes, the world forgets. When a lord does, it writes books and documentaries for decades. The imbalance between those who are remembered and those who are lost between Lucan and Sandra Rivett remains the quiet truth at the heart of it all. In recent years, the story has settled into that strange space between history and folklore. People no longer expect an ending. They treat the mystery itself as the ending. His face, immortalized in grainy black and white photographs, belongs to a Britain that no longer exists, but his shadow still lingers in its cultural memory. The Lucan affair endures, not because of what we know, but because of what we never proved. It stands as a reminder that disappearance can be its own kind of power, and that some absences speak louder than any confession. In the end, perhaps the real ghost is not Lord Lucan at all. It is the truth that slipped away with him. As the years stretch further from that night in 1974, the Lord Lucan mystery feels less like a search for one man and more like a mirror reflecting what a society chooses to protect, what it lets slip away, and what it refuses to forget. The facts are set in stone, yet their meaning keeps shifting. A crime rooted in privilege, a family broken, and a legend born from silence. Maybe the truth about what happened to John Bingham will never surface. Maybe it already has, buried under the weight of time and rumor. But stories like this endure not because they are solved. They endure because they remind us how fragile certainty can be. And so, the name Lord Lucan still lingers, suspended between myth and man, history and memory. The world moved on, but his shadow remains quiet, unresolved, and hauntingly familiar. Thank you for joining me and revisiting one of Britain's most enduring mysteries. If you found this story as compelling as I did, stay tuned for the next case, another story where the truth hides just out of reach. Until then, take care and good night.